Hi, my name is Paul Schultz. I'm a senior software engineer at Red Hat, working mainly on Backstage as well as Red Hat Developer Hub. Now imagine this. You've recently deployed a Backstage instance. You have all your plugins and integrations working seamlessly. It's a central nervous system for your entire developer ecosystem, right? But then you stop and wonder for a second and think, what's the security looking like behind the scenes, right? Because just like any complex application, it requires complex security, right? You need to make sure everything behind the scenes is working seamlessly and there's no malicious actors, right? Hence the need for auditing. This is where the visibility gap comes into play, right? How do you know the who, what, when, where of everything happening within Backstage, right? You have pain points like trouble, you have a security incident that occurs. How do you know and identify where that happens, right? And you may think to yourself, well, we can solve this by just logging, right? Not always. You need a dedicated system to be able to audit properly, to know and analyze where everything is happening, right? Because ad hoc logging ultimately leads to missing data, incomplete information. So when that analysis ends up occurring, it's difficult to find what you actually need. Further, you can look at compliance and regulations, right? Especially if you're a bank or you have government contracts, you need to comply with security standards, right? For example, like NIST. And the consequences for not following those guidelines could ultimately mean like not being able to deploy Backstage at all. So what's the solution for this? Having a dedicated auditing system to allow everything to be centralized in one spot. That's where the Backstage Auditor comes into play. The Backstage Auditor was introduced in Backstage version 1.36. It's a new built-in service for all security-related tracking. It's a central spot to track any sort of security action, right? This allows you to gain visibility to secure your Backstage environment. Some key features: any sort of data access. So you have your API endpoints. Whenever someone accesses one of those API endpoints, just like that, you'll have an audit log triggered. Just like configuration changes. Whenever someone makes a key configuration change, you'll now know and have that in your log. Further, you'll just get more complete information, right? You'll get the who, what, when, where of every sort of action possibly that could lead to a malicious event occurring. You can further prioritize it by having different severity levels. You have low, medium, high, and critical events. So that way, whether you're in Splunk or Elasticsearch, whatever service you're using to collect these logs, you can accurately categorize them and know which events you need to look for. Lastly, you can know the outcome by easily seeing if an action succeeded or failed, because there's an audit log that is triggered every single time the API endpoint is accessed. Then whenever it's the action that endpoint does is completed, right? So that way, let's say there's a permission failure, it'll trigger another fail audit log. Or if it just succeeded, it'll be perfectly fine. Now digging a little bit more into the details of how the auditor works. It's a very simplistic API. To introduce it, all you need to do is in your plugin factory, add the service factory for the auditor, pipe it into your router or wherever you need the auditor, and then you have a few methods. Your first method is the auditor.createEvent. Your auditor.createEvent is that initiating audit log that will be sent to the user. You might not necessarily have the complete information of everything that you need, but that can be later fulfilled with the success and fail. So after you do the create event, it returns an object that has two other additional methods. You have an auditor event success and an auditor event fail. As the name implies, with success, you do that every single time everything works perfectly fine. And with fail, It'll have an additional field with error. That way you can track the error that actually occurred, whether that may be a 400 error, 500 error, permissions error, whatever it may be. Now looking at the actual shapes of the auditor that you'll be looking at in Splunk, Elasticsearch, whatever you're using to collect these logs. First, we have the audit event status, right? Like I previously mentioned, you have the initiated, succeeded, failed, and if you look as well, you have that error within that failed object. Then you have the actual auditor event log in general. That contains plugin, event ID, severity level, actor, some metadata, request, and to signify the event status. The plugin ID, like the name suggests, since the auditor core service is plugin scoped, it will automatically take the name of the plugin. The event ID then should be unique for each plugin. So you can have multiple ping events, but as long as it's a different plugin name, everything should be perfectly fine. The severity levels, like I previously mentioned, low, medium, high, and critical. You have your actor and your request object, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Your metadata object, the metadata object can be used to add additional information after the request or whatever it may be has been processed. For example, if it's related to RBAC, you can state the permission or policy that's changed. Or if it's processing something like in the catalog, you can show all the catalog entities that ended up changing. Next, we have the auditor event actor details. The actor details is the who aspect of the audit event. It has the actor ID. The majority of the time, this will either be a Backstage service ID, or it will be the user ID within Backstage. You have the IP address, host name, and user agent. Then you have the request object. If you notice that this request object is not the same shape as a normal request object you might see in Node, this is done because after investigation, we've realized we don't really need the entire request object. So to simplify it and to keep your logs smaller, we only store the URL as well as the method. Now on to a quick demo. Originally, I had this recorded, but I thought, might as well just go all out. Let's make sure that I increase the screen size. Okay. So first, what I ended up doing, as you can see, I ended up running yarn new. Yarn new just creates, it's a Backstage CLI. It allows you to create a brand new plugin. You could then select whether it's a front end, back end plugin, and then specifically on top of that, you can specify if it's a module. What I've ended up doing is I've created a plugin called just cool plugin, right? Then under there, I've ended up deleting some files in there just for simplicity purposes, because this demo doesn't really require them. So looking into the actual source code, we have the router object as well as the factory for the plugin itself. So just to make sure everything works, let's try starting it real quick. So let's use yarn dev. It'll take a second to start running. Should pop up in the web in a second. We don't really have to worry about that too much. And then what you can see is when you run under Thunder Client, we can then see run the request. We can see that everything is working perfectly fine because I've created in here a get router just specifically for the endpoint called cool endpoint. We have a 200 and a 500. The try body is just there. It'll make more sense once we actually add the auditor implementation in there. So now on to actually getting the auditor core service working and running. So first, we'll need to add the actual auditor service. This can just be done by adding in the factory, the core service, under dependencies, just the auditor. Then we'll need to pass the auditor to the router. Just as simple as passing it like that. It'll error out for now just because we don't have that in the router.ts file. Now looking at the router.ts file, first we'll need to access that auditor object that I just created. Since we're using TypeScript, we'll make sure to add the proper interfaces. Then we have auditor service. That should automatically populate. Now, if you go back here, we should have the auditor working once we properly pass it. Now we have the auditor properly being passed to the router. Next, let's create the actual event. So within each individual endpoint, what we'll need to do, simple as auditor.create event. Then we'll have an event ID. Let's specify this as, in this case, we'll just do cool audit event, right? You save it. Now, it won't necessarily show right away because what ends up happening is by default, all audit events will be on low. When it's on low, it'll be sent to the debug channel in Winston. And the debug channel by default does not show on your logs. So the actual show on the logs will change the severity level to medium, just for demonstration purposes. You'd want medium if it's any sort of like write event, because you might want to raise awareness to an event that changes some sort of data, right? Then we can go back to the endpoint, send another request, and now you'll see this last request that ended up happening. You have cool plugin.cool audit event as the message, the event ID right here of the cool audit event. You have the severity level. And then you also have the plugin information right here, some of the actor details right there. But we are missing some critical data in here. Then we can set the request object, save it, send the request again once everything loads. Now we'll have even more information because now we're passing the request object. It's critical, if possible, to pass the request object because it'll be able to populate that actor details. Next, let's show when it succeeds and fails. You will want to create an object called auditor event, assign it, and then after the request is processed, because that's when you'll most likely have that data that you'll need to add in the metadata, you can do auditor event I'll need to do wait on the next one, yes. Needed to make sure we add the async part. Then we have the auditor event dot success, and let's save it, rerun it. We can do the same thing with the error. We can do auditor event dot fail, and this does require the error object to be passed in. Save it, rerun it. Now, if you notice, when we'll run and request the endpoint, you'll see two audit events actually being there. This is because you'll know when it succeeds and fails, right? So we'll have these two right here being shown. First one being initiated, the second one being succeeded. Then, additionally, talking about that metadata, right? Let's say the request does some processing, and now you can add some metadata to make sure that everything is actually there. We could add in some cool metadata, as simple as like a message of catalog entities, right? Now, that sort of information will be stored when the endpoint is hit. And as you can see, adding the auditor itself is quite simple. It's just making sure you pass in the auditor core service into your router or into whatever place you end up needing the auditor service, using the methods provided, and going from there. Now, we can take a little bit deeper dive into the factory. The factory is where potentially you might want to have some custom implementation done, right? Because by default, everything gets logged to the terminal, right? Which is not always useful. Let's say you want to have it be piped to Splunk, Elasticsearch. You might have to set that up yourself. That's also where we can create a different stream. Because by default, you can end up doing under default auditor service.create. This is just a log function right here. So any sort of logger that you want, if you want to switch to the native logger within Node or whatever you want to modify the Winston logger so that way you have two different streams, you can do that. And then that way you can just pipe in your audit data into one part of Splunk, and then let's say you do your normal audit data into Elasticsearch. That is perfectly fine as well. And then, as you may see above, this is a new feature that's coming down the line, and this will be entirely customizable in your app config. That way, if I were to want to switch a severity level, I can make low switch to info instead. So now, if I were to switch this, again, you'd be able to switch this under your app config under auditlog.severitylevel.low. Then, if you were to modify your endpoint and change the severity level, it will now always be piped to the info. Or if you want to switch this critical severity level to the high stream in your Winston logger, that's perfectly fine as well. Now going back to the presentation. That's probably gonna that. Let's go over some benefits real quick. So as you can see, it provides some extra visibility into what's actually happening within Backstage. It allows you to, if some event were to occur, because unfortunately it's not a question of if it happens, it's whenever it's related to security, you can easily perform forensic analysis. It also simplifies compliance needs. So for instance, if you're a bank, or like I said, you're working with government contracts, this allows you to comply with those standards and not needing to worry about these ad hoc logging methods. And lastly, more secure plugins in general allows you to build a more trustworthy Backstage environment. Therefore, you do not need to worry what's happening elsewhere. Now taking a look at the auditor journey. The auditor journey started out in the framework SIG, which if you've not been at the framework SIG before, I'd highly recommend it. It's on Tuesdays. Don't know the time zone off the top of my head, but I'd highly recommend it. It's more of a technical conversation with the core maintainers. So if there's any in-depth question you may have, highly recommend joining and asking a question. But specifically on the auditor, it took about 2 framework SIGs to go through this and to have people get interested in the auditor and why we actually need it within Backstage. Next, we had the Backstage Enhancement Proposal, otherwise known as a BEP. The BEP took about 2 months to go through. It was open inside the community for about a couple weeks. People could comment on it. It was more of an architecture guide, right? Even though 8 weeks or 2 months may sound like a long period of time, in the community, it's one of those things, especially when we're talking about something as important as the auditor, we need to make sure everything is done perfectly the first time. Next, we have the implementation. That took about 4 months to go through. Again, the PR was open, plenty of public comments, trying to figuring out edge cases that we may not have originally thought of. Next, we have the documentation. Again, there's a documentation SIG, which is on Fridays. Highly recommend it. If there's any sort of documentation thing you can think of regarding Backstage, join it. Great place to discuss how to update some docs and make them better. Lastly, plugin adoption. The plugin adoption is currently ongoing. Right now we have 3 plugins, I know for certain, that have fully adopted, or at least for the most part, adopted the auditor. We have the scaffolder, catalog, and then lastly, in the community plugins repo, there's the RBAC plugin. Now looking to where next. Auditing user sessions for more deeper insights. Currently, we do not track auditor session info in general. This is one area where I do believe we could really help get further insights, because unfortunately it's also one of those things where it's the failures that are actually more indicative of some sort of malicious attack than a success, because you have typically multiple failed events that happen before a successful event occurs. Then you can also expect further plugin integrations for more coverage, more plugin adoption, in general, more secure. Lastly, just more integration with tools that actually analyze the data, whether that may be Splunk, Elasticsearch, your choice. If that data could then be viewed within Backstage as a security engineer, then you don't even need to leave Backstage. Some key takeaways. The Auditor Core Service is your new place for all auditing needs. It has a comprehensive event capture system to make sure all the data that you need is all in one spot. And lastly, this would not exist without the community. The more feedback we have and the more contributions we have, the more successful we can make this, and to make sure that Backstage is secure. And lastly, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'll be out in the pavilion area, or whatever you call it. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask me.